Can I just have a quick show of hands? Anyone with a personal connection to the Chindits in the room today? That might have been why it was sold out so quickly. Fantastic. Right, here we go, the Chindits. That's what I'm going to sort of talk about. Bit of a sort of spoiler alert. I won't actually explain what the word Chindit and how it was formed until about there. All right, but I think one or two of you might know already. Okay, so we've heard a bit about the dire background situation, the retreat when the Japanese invaded. That became an opportunity for a certain Orde Wingate. I'll talk a bit back in history about Wingate's background and his development of his long-range penetration theory. The two main Chindit operations, Longcloth in 43 and Thursday in 44. I will touch on support to the Battle of Kohima and then have a little chat at the end about the Chindits' overall contribution to Allied victory. A mention of some commanders to the top left. Some of these have been mentioned before. We have then General Auchinleck, who was Commander-in-Chief India at the time of the Japanese invasion. We have Bill Slim, who commanded the Burma Corps and later was to command 14th Army and defeat into victory and all the rest of it. Bottom left, there's the man, Orde Wingate himself. And bottom right, a name hasn't been mentioned too much, General Joseph Vinegar Joe Stilwell, who was the American Chief of Staff to Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek of the Nationalist Chinese, which was a key element, as you'll discover a bit later. And he ended up as 2IC of the overall Southeast Asia Command. And we have a hand, and I'm not sure if that's legal.
I'm so sorry, the figure in the top left-hand corner is Sir Archibald Wade.
Did I say Auchinleck? Thank you. Slip of the tongue, it was because it was mentioned earlier. Wavell, correct, Wavell. Very important. Thank you very much for correcting me. I'll let you live this time. Okay, and there he is again, Wavell. So he was in command of India. There is the sort of the Japanese invasion, and you'll see various arrows. And the blue ones are the sort of the Chinese going off to China. Some Chinese went north. Burma Corps went north back to the Indian border. So things are going dreadfully wrong. Wavell remembered someone somewhat different who he had seen in a few places around the world before, and he thought it was an opportunity. Desperate measures were needed in a desperate situation. And he called forward a man called Orde Wingate. So a quick bit on Wingate. 1921 to 23, he did the commissioning course at the Royal Military Academy, Woolwich, following which he was commissioned into the Royal Artillery. He didn't do a lot of artillery gunner stuff. He went off on an Arabic course, and after that, he then went on an expedition to Sudan in 1927. So he was sort of getting his head around overseas service, and he liked what he saw out in Africa, in Sudan, and he then did a job in Sudan. So, his long-range penetration theory first of all started in that Sudan posting, 1928 to 33, with the Sudan Defence Force. And he was using Sudanese troops, and you can see them down bottom left, and they were on the sort of the border, Sudan, Ethiopia, the sort of shifter bandits, and he was using local troops or guerrilla tactics well off the grid, and certainly nothing like traditional Royal Artillery stuff. 3 years of artillery stuff back in England. He then went out again, this time to Middle East, to Palestine, and in 1936 to 39, he was set up the Special Night Squads, and these were dealing with Arab terrorists who were attacking the incoming Jews, who were setting up settlements, kibbutzim, and they were also attacking the pipeline bringing oil across from Iraq. And so he set those people up, the Special Night Squads, and that was when he first came to the attention of Wavell, who was there at the time, and he got his first DSO for his work with the Special Night Squads. We then have the next adventure, which was in Abyssinia, as Ethiopia was known, and in 1940-41 he commanded a thing called Gideon Force, and there he is next to Haile Selassie, who through his efforts, they threw out the Italians from Abyssinia and put Haile Selassie back on the throne in Addis Ababa, for which he got another DSO, and again was noticed by Wavell. So that is Orde Wingate. Coming back to Burma 1942, he arrived, Wingate, in about March, as things were starting to speed up and go wrong. He met a certain Major Mike Calvert, who was commanding a guerrilla warfare school in the north of Burma, and the two of them basically realized that they quite liked the cut of each other's jib, and that they could both do business together in the future. Wingate did some recce's. He had a few skirmishes directly with Japanese, but he came back to India, reported back to Wavell that yes, he thought he could do something to help the general situation if he could be given some men and some people to do something with. And so Wavell authorized the formation of the 77th Indian Infantry Brigade. It wasn't a real brigade, it was a cover name for the first trial long-range penetration brigade, otherwise known as Special Force. And they trained in central India for an offensive into Burma in early 1943. That was the order of battle of 77th Brigade at the time. Only 2 battalions of infantry, a King's Liverpool battalion and 3rd Battalion of the 2nd Gurkha Rifles. There were some commandos, which had some demolition sappers, because they were planning on blowing a lot of things up. Very importantly, a battalion from the Burma Rifles, known as Burifs, and they, of course, brought with them local knowledge, knowledge of culture, language, and chaps could just literally put on a lungi and then sort of go into a Burmese village and talk Burmese, buy eggs and fish, borrow a boat or whatever. So they were going to be invaluable, adding a certain sort of degree of flexibility to otherwise obviously foreigners out in Burma. And then, of course, to keep the things going, signals detachment, absolutely vital for communications back to Chindit HQ, wasn't called that then, to the long-range penetration HQ back in India. Medical detachments doing the best they could to deal with the horrendous medical challenges of serving out there in the Burmese conditions. Dengue fever, malaria, typhoid, scrub typhoid, sores, ulcers, leeches, all the rest of it. A big problem. Medics with the troops were going to try and address that. And RAF ground detachments, absolutely vital, because the Chindits were going to do something different. They were not going to have vehicles. They were going to rely totally on air resupply throughout what they were going to do. And the 1st Brigade, 77th Brigade, about 3,200 men in HQ and 8 columns. Now, why was this region important? It's been touched on, but for those who haven't been in on previous talks, there is Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, and he and other Chinese nationalists and Mao Zedong and the communists had stopped their civil war, and they were now facing the common enemy of Japan. And the Allies picked on Chiang Kai-shek to be the one to support, and basically the Chinese were pinning down about 750,000 Japanese in China, which if they weren't fixed there, could be available to push further forward of Japanese expansion, perhaps towards Australia or into India or whatever. So anything that could be done to keep Chiang Kai-shek and his nationalist Chinese supplied was a good thing. So from the bottom, you can see that stuff was coming up from Rangoon, up through the middle of northern Burma, and then onto the Burma Road, and going to the hinterland of China, where Chiang Kai-shek and his troops were receiving them gratefully. So, unfortunately, when the Japanese invaded, they pushed us out of Burma, and they, of course, had now jumped ahead and above and were therefore blocking the Burma Road. So we still needed to keep Chiang Kai-shek and the Chinese in the war, and so the decision was made to start up flying stuff in from here, the end of the railway and the river route up here, and they produced the air resupply flying over what they called the hump, the foothills of the Himalayas. Not as efficient as a road thing, but at least it was getting stuff to Chiang Kai-shek and his troops. So, the background to Operation Longcloth. Wingate wanted to trial his brigade. So he spoke to Wavell, and Wavell said, OK, you can do something into a bit of northern Burma, but what we'll try and do is combine it with a Chinese push from the east and a British push into the Arakan. That way, the Japanese won't be able to concentrate solely on defeating you with your single brigade. That was a great idea. Unfortunately, for various reasons, the Chinese offensive fizzled away, and we've heard that the Arakan didn't really work either. So it just ended up with 77 brigades push into northern Burma. It was a risk. Wavell gave Wingate the choice of not going, but Wingate said, no, I want to give it a try. I do want to give it a push. So Wavell said, crack on then. Don't worry about the detail, but what you'll get in general is 2 routes. The northern route was the main part. That was Wingate in his headquarters and 5 columns worth of 77th Brigade, whereas at the bottom was a deception plan. There were 2 columns and a fake brigade headquarters, including a man with a pith helmet looking like Wingate, talking loudly near Burmese villages. So a bit of deception in the south, and the main advance happened to the north. And as they advanced up to 150 miles into northern Burma, they did bump into the odd Japanese unit, there was the odd skirmish, but wherever possible they avoided contact, slithered around, slipped through the jungle, slept in covert locations, then popped out to blow up railway lines, bridges, ambush convoys, blow up supply dumps, etc., etc. So what was life like for the people advancing into Burma? It was all on foot. Everything they carried was either on their back or on their mules and ponies. The ground was horrendous, really, really rough terrain, jungly, mountainous. This was the drier period, so the aim of doing it in the early part of the year was to avoid the wet season. So there wasn't always water available, but where there were rivers, they had to be crossed. Radio communication back to base was essential for calling in air resupplies, and they'd identify a potential drop zone, send back the shopping list, and just like Ocado, over will come the Dakotas and drop stuff down onto them. But that would, of course, give away their position. So very quickly, they would gather the stuff up, break it down into the column, company, platoon groups. The chaps would put it into their packs, put it on their mules, and then get the hell out of Dodge as quickly as possible, in case they'd attracted the attention of Japanese. One of the heavy things they carried was ammunition and explosives, because they were going to blow a lot of things up. And there they are blowing up a railway line. And the trick was not just to blow up the railway line on a flat bit. If you could do it over a culvert or a bridge, it would, of course, increase the hassle for the Japanese to rebuild it and repair that particular route, line of communication, railway, road, whatever. The big issue was what to do with these people, sick and wounded. There was no way of getting them out. If you couldn't get better quickly, you were left behind. And that was weighing on the minds of every man on this particular operation. One or two could sit on a horse for a couple of days in case they had a minor tummy problem or whatever, but to be honest, if you had a severe wound or horrendous illness, you were left basically to die. You were left with a pistol and a grenade, up to you what you did with it. One or two were left in Burmese villages. Sometimes they were then handed over to the Japanese by the villagers for money. It was a gamble. That was, imagine, weighing on the mind of every individual. What happens if I can't keep up? And I'll come back to that a bit later. So they go for about 5-6 weeks into northern Burma. They even having crossed the Chindit on the west for the Indian border, they even crossed the Irrawaddy, and they were now in this area when the Japanese had finally twigged what was going on. They knew people were out there. They couldn't believe that they didn't have vehicles, but eventually they realized that they were on foot, and the Japanese started closing in on them, and they were in the Shweli Triangle, and eventually the decision was made, we've done enough, we've proved the point, let us now disperse back to India. And almost like British bulldogs, they sort of headed as best they could in dispersion groups back to the west towards India. One or two were imaginative, went northeast, east to China, and one group certainly went to China and ended up being flown back, lucky them. Others went north and then circled round. But basically it was get back to India as quick as you can. And by about the end of May, those who were going to got back. So about 3,000 went into Burma. They'd lost a couple of hundred in training. So about 3,000 went into Burma. And you can see the figures there, the butcher's bill. About 800 were killed or died, captured or missing, nearly 30%. But those who got back, 53% were wounded or sick or just unfit for further operations. And only about 600 or 20% were fit for further operations, so it had really done a lot of damage to their bodies. However, there were several achievements. It was the first successful fight back against the Japanese. It proved the Japanese were not invincible, and generally it was a morale boost for the troops in India, and it proved that Wingate's long-range penetration theory could work. The mules instead of vehicles, that was a success. Radio communications did work. They could speak to the Air Force, speak to base HQ, and get stuff flown out. And that air support resupply thing was absolutely essential. Also, the business of dispersed movement and perhaps, gathering together for coordinated actions for particular attacks, that was also a success. So all in all, that was good. Plus, lessons were learned for future operations. Now, Wingate's report obviously went up his chain of command to Wavell. However, he made sure that a friend in London slipped it to Winston Churchill. He knew how to play the system. And Churchill said, I like the sound of this, get Wingate back to London. So Wingate was flown back, met Churchill. Churchill was highly impressed and said, I'm about to go and meet Roosevelt across the Atlantic in Canada. Come with me. Wingate said, I haven't seen my wife for a couple of years, So Churchill arranged for Mrs. Wingate, Lorna, to be picked up, and they joined each other at Liverpool docks, and they spent the crossing of the Atlantic on the Queen Mary, getting to know each other again and conceiving their one and only child. Because after that trip, they never saw each other again. So it's a very good thing that Mrs. Wingate was picked up by Churchill's little police squad, was sent together. So they got to Quebec Conference, otherwise known as Quadrant, and Wingate had an audience with Roosevelt. Roosevelt was likewise impressed. He thought, this is stuff that is going to match American aims as well. And one of the things that Wingate said he needed more of was air support. So Roosevelt asked his air commander, Hap Arnold, provides a mixed air group, and it was the USAF 1st Air Commando Group was provided. That had a variety of aircraft, quite amazing. There was the Dakota transport planes, some gliders for insertions, light aircraft for reconnaissance, but also for casualty evacuation, P-51 Mustangs for fighter ground attack, B-25H Mitchell bombers, but the H version had a 75mm gun in the nose, and it could also act as an aerial gunship. So quite advanced stuff. But the key thing, well, not the key thing, but quite interestingly, was experimental helicopters. 6 of those went out with the US Air Commando Group, and more of that anon. So in addition to that, Roosevelt said that we've got to have greater coordination with our US and the Chinese forces with Stilwell. And the Chindits, indeed, those who'd been on the first operation, some of them trained this extraordinary unit, the 5,307th Composite Unit Provisional, which, thank goodness, soon became known as Merrill's Marauders after their colonel. All right, and some of those, they were trained by some of the Chindits from the first operation. The Chindit force itself was enlarged to 6 brigades, and extra resources allocated, especially aircraft, not just American, but also Royal Air Force. And a larger operation was planned for 1944 to be known as Operation Thursday. This is when the Chindit name came about. Wingate needed now to have a formation badge, because they were now official, they'd passed their sort of test, and so he picked a chinthi. There's pairs of them that guard all the Buddhist pagodas across Burma, and so he picked one of those as the badge, and what he did do was notice this top layer, this top step, like all the badges in that one with the 14th Army, certain things behind it. Well, this one has the top step going ... dash, which is, in Morse code, V for victory. So it's a little psychological lift just from the badge alone. The British troops, given the name Chinthi, in Burmese can even sound a bit Chindi, but basically the British troops mispronounced it and it ended up as Chindit, and the name Chindit eventually stuck. So that's where the name Chindit came from. Also around this time, in 43, Admiral Louis Mountbatten, we heard about him. He came from the Combined Operations in the UK and became the Supreme Allied Commander, Southeast Asia Command, or SEAC. So he's now top dog in SEAC. So Operation Thursday, it was going to be started officially in March. It says it ends in August. It wasn't meant to run that long, but we'll come on to that later. And now the newly promoted Major General Orde Wingate is in command of 6 brigades. So 16th Brigade and 77th Brigade, the 2 commanders there, Bernard Ferguson and Mike Calvert, had both been column commanders on Longcloth, had proved their worth, both got their DSOs under Wingate in the first operation. He knew he could trust them, and they were promoted from Major up to Brigadier. So they commanded the first 2 brigades. 111th Brigade, a Brigadier Joe Lentane, a very brave Gurkha officer, got his DSO in the retreat up from southern Burma in 1942. A Nigerian 3rd West African Brigade, full of Nigerian soldiers, a couple of brigade commanders there, and 14th and 23rd Brigade are sort of normal English brigades with some Gurkha attachments. The 23rd Brigade in particular was kept back as the reserve, so it was going to be 5 brigades, those top 5, being launched into northern Burma in the initial plan. So again, I'll come back to this in bits. You'll see in this area here some blue and white boxes. Those are the sort of the places where the Chindits were going to set up various sort of strong points and blocking positions. It was how they got there. There was a fly-in going to be planned, the green arrows, and the red arrows shows the Japanese going the other way, exactly the same time, for their attack on Kohima and Imphal. But before that happened, that was going to be in March and onwards, in February, 16th Brigade, they set off on foot and they did a long march in to a place that they were going to set up, codenamed Aberdeen. Brigadier Ferguson had already done the first march in on Operation Longcloth. He drew the short straw and had to march in again. That long, long march really broke the brigade. When they arrived in the operational area, they were knackered. They'd had lots of people already gone sick, and it was all pretty difficult when they got to Aberdeen. We'll touch on that in a minute. So there he is. Later Lord Ballantrae, and later still he was Governor-General of New Zealand. An eccentric but splendid chap, very bright and loved by his troops. His brigade had an odd mixture, field regiment and a reconnaissance regiment from the Armour Corps in the infantry role. I bet they weren't used to that. 2nd Battalion of the Queen's Royal Regiment, my old regiment, the Queen's, so yeah, splendid lot. 2nd Leicesters, the Tigers, some Royal Engineers, and then the normal mix of Burma Rifles, Signals Medics, and RAF Ground Detachments. So that lot set off, they did that 5-6 week march, and they got to the Aberdeen stronghold, okay? Once they got there, they were off the beaten track. They weren't blocking Japanese lines of communication, so they had a bit more relaxed perimeter with bits dotted around, like plane camp from some of the American Air Commando aircraft, and different units set up themselves around, and they constructed an airstrip. Bulldozers were glided in and then made a strip so that Dakotas could come in, etc., etc. They quickly reorganized themselves and had to go attacking a place called Indore, where there were a couple of Japanese airfields and supply dumps. Frankly, without the monsoon coming, the water had run out. Their knackering of the march in, I'm afraid their whole brigade attack failed, and they were withdrawn back to India. In disgrace would be the wrong word, but it just went horrendously wrong, and that brigade was exhausted. So they were relieved in the Aberdeen area by 14th and the 3rd West African Brigades, which used Aberdeen mainly as their fly-in location. And as I say, the light planes were flown forward, and indeed some of the early experimental helicopters were flown forward to Aberdeen. So that was 16th Brigade. The next lot to fly in on the night of the 5th, 6th of March were 77th Brigade, which were going to fly into 2 landing zones, Piccadilly and Broadway. So you can imagine the brigade split into 2 lots, aircraft and gliders loaded with troops going to 2 different landing zones. There is 77th Brigade. You can see this is a larger brigade than the original 77th Brigade. We've now got 3 British battalions, 2 Gurkha battalions, more Royal Engineers, a company of Hong Kong volunteers who'd escaped from Hong Kong and managed to get to India and rejoin the fight, and again the usual set of Burma Rifles, Medics, Signals, RAF Ground Detachment, etc. And there's that Mike Calvert, or Mad Mike, as he was nicknamed. They were going to be inserted by glider, the Waco glider from the Americans, and into Broadway and Piccadilly, as originally shown, for the night of the 5th, 6th of March. That afternoon, however, an American aircraft flew over Piccadilly, took some photos, because he could see logs all over the landing zone, which would have meant any gliders landing would have smashed up, would have been horrendous. And there they are saying, what are we going to do? Wingate is there. He very, very kindly held himself back and left it to Calvert to work through. So you've got Calvert there, they've got Wingate, you've got Cochrane and Allison, the 2 American colonels in charge of the air commandos. There's Scotty Scott, the King's Liverpool CO, and they're all saying, what are we going to do? So they said, was it a trap? Had they blocked one and left the other one open so that when everyone lands there, there'll be a big ambush? They didn't know. Calvert just said, I'll give it a go, but let me take my whole brigade into Broadway. And that was the decision taken. They then hastily arranged all the loading orders of the aircraft and gliders, and only half an hour later than the original takeoff time, Operation Thursday was launched from Lalagat base, based on the new plan, all flying into Broadway. They were double-towed gliders, so they could get twice as many per tug plane. That was dodgy in itself. Sometimes the cables crossed, and they lost nearly half the gliders on that first night fly. And out of nearly 70 that flew in, only 30-something got through. So it was a risk, but they got just enough on the ground. However, the carnage on landing, and there is the landing zone, David Rowland's painting. There is Scotty Scott, CO of the King's Liverpool. Every single glider landed, their undercarriage was ripped off, they couldn't be moved out the way, so the next one would come in and crash into it, and so it went on. So there were quite a few casualties on landing, out of the ones that even got there. And initially, Calvert said, this isn't going to work, and he sent off initially the signal for failure, the code word for failure. However, in the morning, they assessed things. A light bulldozer had come in with some American airborne engineers, and they reckoned they could make it work. So They worked all day of the 6th of May and scraped and graded and shoveled and everything. And by nightfall, they had got a landing strip fit for Dakotas with landing lights. So that the signal was changed to success, and then the rest of 77 Brigade flew in on subsequent nights. So it just worked out. The follow-on troops, they were all waiting to be called forward at Lalagat, which of course were troops, and of course for onward movement they needed their mules. Not being exactly frequent flyers, they probably took a bit of encouragement and persuasion to get on board. No mention of the bar and the free food, it wasn't worth it. So they were chucked on board as well, and the fly-in continued. There is Broadway from the air, obviously with all the wrecked gliders removed. And that was off the beaten track, so it became a stronghold, but not a blocking position, because now Wingate had a new idea that in some of the Chindits would go into places, secure themselves, and sort of tempt the Japanese to come to them and deal with them attacking them, rather than go off sort of wandering around the countryside. That was part of 77 Brigade was going to stay there under the Deputy Commander, Claude Rome, whereas Calvert was going to lead most of the brigade southwest and set up a stronghold oblique blocking position known as White City on the Japanese lines of communication. So that's them coming in, the red arrows showing them coming down from the northeast. At the end of this wooded, hilly feature, you can see it's right by the road and railway going up towards Myitkyina, which is where General Stilwell and the Merrill's Marauders and the Chinese are coming down, and that is the main line of communication. So it's going to do its job of treading on the hosepipe of Japanese supplies. And what we had here was a very quick early battle, because there were some Japanese on a little feature called Pagoda Hill, and Lieutenant George Cairns got a posthumous Victoria Cross, the first of 4 Chindit Victoria Crosses, establishing the White City perimeter on the battle for Pagoda Hill. Shown here, another David Rowland's picture. Cairns was part of a bayonet charge led personally by Mike Calvert. He said, well, what are we hanging around for? Let's do a bayonet charge. And so the 1st South Staffords, and on the other side, 6 Gurkha rifles. Literally, they ran across the road, up the hill, and got stuck into the Japanese on top of Pagoda Hill. Cairns himself had his left arm severed by a Japanese officer's sword. He managed to get the sword off him, killed the officer, killed another load of Japanese, and then collapsed of his wounds right in front of his brigade commander. Very good career move. Because Calvert then wrote him up for a Victoria Cross. Sadly, in sort of Nelson and General Wolfe style, he was able to blurt out to Calvert, how did we do, sir? Did we win? And Calvert said, yes, young man, you know, we've won. He said, oh, thank goodness, and then died. All marvellous stuff for the citation. So there we go. That was the first Chindit VC, Cairns up on Pagoda Hill on the 17th of March, 1944. So the perimeter now of White City was secured. Very quickly, they established a light aircraft strip on one side of the railway and a Dakota strip on the other. And then the Dakotas were able to come in bringing mines, barbed wire, sandbags, 25-pounder guns, 2-pounder anti-tank guns, and basically turn that place into a fortress that would be very hard for any Japanese to attack, particularly as it was a long way from the front line and it was only rear area troops, you know, sort of maintenance companies and clerks and, you know, storage companies and all that sort of stuff. So they were a long way from any immediate Japanese response, but they were sitting now and ambushing convoys and stopping things going up the railway. So they were in a good place and in a good defensive position. There is the light aircraft strip. Here's the railway. Oops. Here is the railway. They've already taken some of the railway lines off to make sure trains weren't going to run. The Dakota strip was this side, and you can see the hilly, wooded nature of the position. Ideal defensive position, covered, lots of folds in the ground, etc., etc. With the aircraft that he had at his disposal, Wingate was very good at getting forward and meeting his commanders. This is actually a meeting at Broadway. We got Merrill's Marauders, we got Allison from the Americans, there is Calvert, there is Wingate's ADC, Wingate, Scotty Scott, commander of the King's Liverpool, and that's 77 Brigade Chief of Staff. You know, they would fly around meeting each other, and Wingate would pass on new orders and G up his commanders, etc., etc. So that was all very well and good. Unfortunately, having done that, flying back to Imphal, he was then in one of the B-25s flying from Imphal to Chindit headquarters, and that plane crashed. All on board were killed. The Chindits had lost Wingate, and that was a huge tragedy. March the 24th. The operation had only been going 3 weeks. So they'd lost their inspiration at the top. What do? Well, the system said who is going to command the whole division, in effect. Calvert was the best, but he was doing a brilliant job at White City, so they took Lentane, Joe Lentane from 111th Brigade. Overall command of the Chindits was then passed to General Stilwell. By this stage, by May, Imphal and Kohima battles are pretty well won, so actually diverting the sort of Chindit effort and cutting lines of communication to support Stilwell's Chinese and American push perhaps makes a bit of sense, but certainly Stilwell believed charity started at home. So, Chindits were directed north to support that US-Chinese offensive towards Myitkyina. 111th Brigade were told to set up another blocking position further north, closer to Myitkyina, and once that was up, then 77th Brigade would leave White City, and they'd been told to capture a town. Nothing like they were trained or planned to do under Wingate, but it was Stilwell's orders. And the other two brigades, 3rd West African and 14th, they closed down White City and Aberdeen, and they themselves headed north towards Myitkyina. Around about that time, in fact, April the 26th, the first world ever helicopter casualty evacuation was carried out of a wounded Chindit by one of the experimental helicopters. So those of you who think it was the Korean War or even Vietnam War, no, April the 26th, 1944, Chindit, first man ever evacuated by helicopter. Another little air experiment that the Americans did was if a glider had landed and wasn't smashed to bits on landing, they could rig up their tow rope, suspend it between two poles, and then a Dakota would come along with a hook and drag it into the air. And that way they could take it back to base and reuse it. You could put prisoners in there. People needed to go back to base for whatever. So a bit of a ride, a bit of a sort of funfair jolt. But it was a way of getting workable gliders back to base to be reused. So good imaginative thinking on the part of the American Air Commandos. I must also mention that period 23rd Brigade. They had been held in reserve, but they weren't needed as a reserve for the Chindits, and so it was decided to deploy them to the east and southeast of Kohima, and they were in the Naga Hills, and they basically much closer in to the rear of the Japanese attacking Kohima and worked on their lines of communication and wore them down. So they contributed to the successful defense of Kohima and the defeat of the Japanese 31st Division. And that's what 23rd Brigade achieved as a Chindit brigade. But they worked for nearly 2 months in horrendous conditions and did really well. So, back to the bigger picture again, 111th Brigade, now under command of their brigade major. Have people heard of John Masters, the novelist, Rode Past Mandalay, Bugles and the Tiger? Nobody wanted to become the brigadier. Somebody was made the brigadier, but he was off on a flanking movement with a Gurkha battalion, and so the brigade major became the commander. As a major, he was giving orders to the lieutenant colonels, COs. Everyone was quite happy just to keep with their battalion and let him be the brigade commander. And he set up this new blocking position near Nam Quin, which became known as Blackpool. Once that was done, 77th Brigade left White City and the other half in Broadway, and they moved up to the north as well. They were tasked to support 111th Brigade, and indeed a Gurkha battalion and the King's Liverpool from Broadway did get across to Blackpool and joined 111th Brigade to thicken them up, but the rest of the brigade couldn't get there, and so they just carried on going up towards Magaung. Here we have Blackpool position. First thing I hope you'll notice is there's the road and the railway. They're not standing on the hosepipe. It's over a mile away from it, so it doesn't really do the job of blocking. And in Japanese stuff, once White City was removed, stuff was starting to go up the road and railway again, so they didn't actually block it. It was quite good, it was wooded and hilly, they had water, there was room for an airstrip, but they didn't have much time to fly stuff in before the Japanese, whose front line was just up here, were able to turn frontline troops against them and heavy artillery, all against Wingate's principles. And that life in Blackpool became very quickly horrendous. They were outnumbered by artillery and mortars from the Japanese, frontline troops attacking, and eventually the airstrip, they couldn't use it anymore, it was under fire, and then the monsoon broke early. So even if the Japanese had allowed it, by anti-aircraft fire or whatever, the weather was so bad that air resupply and air casualty evacuation ceased, and I'm afraid Blackpool went down the plug hole very, very quickly. They were only there for about 3 weeks, and it all went dreadfully wrong. Quick vignette. Bill Smiley, he'd already done Operation Longcloth. He was so sick from that, he rejoined late on Operation Thursday, went via Aberdeen, went via White City, ended up tucked in with the Gurkha battalion on Blackpool position. There he is with Orde Wingate's daughter-in-law and Orde Wingate's granddaughter. That's Holly and Alice. And Bill Smiley told me personally how As the brigade left the position of Blackpool, they shot their wounded because they couldn't carry the most seriously wounded, and they shot about 20 of them to save them falling alive into Japanese hands. And Bill told me personally how he shot one wounded man between the eyes with his revolver with the Japanese 10 yards behind him and then ran off. So a very, very tragic time. 111th Brigade abandoned Blackpool and they went north. They somehow found a gap. The encircling Japanese had left a gap about here, and they were able, quite a few of them, to get out and head north. And Bill was one of those who managed to get away. So Blackpool collapsed. No longer is anyone blocking the lines of communication up to Myitkyina. So bigger picture again, there was Blackpool. As people escaped, loads of wounded from 111th Brigade and the other brigades on the west side of the advance of the Chindits. There is Lake Indorgie. Okay, and Lake Indorgie, someone had a great idea. They organised a shuttle of Sunderland flying boats to come down and do casualty evacuations using Lake Indorgie, and shuttling between Lake Indorgie and there's the Brahmaputra River up behind Imphal and Kohima, and that worked for some weeks and got hundreds of wounded people back to treatment much earlier than otherwise would have happened. So that was a huge improvement. So we now have 77th Brigade will focus in on. They closed Broadway, Long Landing Zone and Stronghold, and the Deputy Commander, Claude Rome, set up a firm base southeast of the town of Magaung, the next objective of 77th Brigade. Calvert and his main body arrived in early June, and over the month of June, 77th Brigade, what was left of it, attacked Magaung. It was a pretty horrendous thing. There were two main phases, getting across a thing called Pinmee Bridge, and then the capture of the town itself and the Battle of the Red House. So there we have to the southeast, that's where Rome set things up, and they had a light airplane strip. Calvert came up and joined, and then they had to get across towards Magaung. Because of the monsoon having already broken, all these waterways were full and flooded. It was really hard to get there, and they really needed to get across Pinmee Bridge. And if I show you a map from 6 Gurkha Rifles records, it shows you a little bit more clear that that bridge was absolutely essential. Lancashire Fusiliers had a go, heavy casualties, but eventually the 6 Gurkha Rifles found a way across the river, and they came from the rear and dealt with the Japanese force on the west side of the bridge, captured Pinmee Bridge, and the way was now clear to head towards Magaung. Officer involved in that was Captain Michael Ormond. He survived that, but he was killed shortly afterwards doing something more heroic on the way towards Magaung, and he got a posthumous Victoria Cross. Then it was the main battle to capture Magaung town, and there was a place called the Red House. Quite a few of the buildings were not brick, but I think the Red House was either painted red or made of red brick, and the railway station was quite substantial. But in the battle around here, in the Battle of Red House, a certain rifleman from 6 Gurkha Rifles, Tul Bahadur Pun, he went forward with a small group. The others were shot around him, but he got there and he dealt with some Japanese bunker positions around the Red House, survived and won a Victoria Cross. So that was the third Chindit Victoria Cross. There we have Brigadier Mike Calvert and the CO and the 2IC of 6 Gurkha Rifles at the wreckage of the main railway station in Magaung. That's Freddie Shaw. And the 2IC of 6 Gurkha Rifles was a certain Major James Lumley, who is, of course, the father of Joanna Lumley, the film star, and all that sort of stuff. So he wasn't just a Gurkha, he was a Chindit in 6 Gurkha Rifles in 77th Brigade. So we have 77th Brigade having captured Magaung. Blackpool's been abandoned, and you can see the brigades have moved forward, and they're now in the sort of dealing with the Japanese positions on the west side of this railway valley. And you've got places like Hill 60, Point 2171, and Pahok West. Japanese forces there were dug in strength, and those brigades started having to do what Wingate had never intended them to do like infantry fighting, and with the sort of the close quarter battle, it was almost like the First World War again, trenches, close quarter stuff, not what was intended. There is the snapshot of some West Africans, Nigerians from the 3rd West African Brigade heading north. And up in that area, Point 2171, Major Frank Gerald Blaker, he won the final Chindit Victoria Cross. He had originally been with 77th Brigade, but then went across to help 111th Brigade at Blackpool, survived that, but in the fighting around Point 2171, sadly, at the head of his company, died a heroic death and was awarded a posthumous Victoria Cross, having earlier won a military cross out in Burma. So an extremely brave gentleman. So the end game for the Chindits. 77th Brigade, as I said, they did capture Magaung by the end of June 1944. They then moved up to Myitkyina, which is where Merrill's Marauders had got to. But even then they couldn't fly out, and they had to go even further to a place called Warrazup to actually get flown back to India. 50% casualties, yeah. Only 350 were left standing out of over 4,500 who went in. Not all of them dead, but many left horrendously damaged, ill, unfit, due to all sorts of privations of what they'd done. And don't forget also that when Wingate sent them in, he thought each Chindit brigade would go in for a month. And they were living off like American K rations, which not exactly, they give you calories, but you can't live on them. They're not good for the body for more than a couple of weeks. A month would have stretched it. These people were there for 3 or 4 months just on these rations, which didn't always get through because with the monsoon breaking, air resupply couldn't happen all the time. So there was a lot of medical issues and health issues due to Chindit service behind Japanese lines. So 77 Brigade went back, and then we had 36th Division, one of 14th Army, having won Imphal, Kohima, and Slim let loose the 14th Army to start pushing the Japanese back out of Burma, and they started coming down and alongside where the Merrill's Marauders had been, and started relieving the remaining Chindit brigades. So you've seen that general picture. So if we have, there we have 36th Division, and they came down, and in particular, they then relieved Hill 60, Point 2171, Pakot West, and each in turn enabled that Chindit brigade to then get on the movement thing up to a bit further north to get flown back to India and go through the same as 77th Brigade with all the medical treatment, etc., etc. So 36th Division came down the Railway Valley and joined up the advance of the rest of 14th Army. So there's a general look at the sort of 14th Army starting to come north to south, and you can see now that they have come to as far as where the old Burma Road went. While all this stuff had been going on, General Stilwell had been encouraging the build of a road from a place called Lado, which was further up here, and that was going to come down and rejoin the Burma Road. And even though the Japanese were down here, by linking up to the Burma Road, we could then get to the road resupply of General Chiang Kai-shek and be more efficient with getting him his supplies. So there is another version of that. Some people called it the Stilwell Road, some people called it the Lado Road, but eventually it did join the Burma Road. That is just one hill showing the engineering effort of going across that horrendous Burmese terrain. That is just one hill. Think of all those hairpin bends being built in, to get to the bottom, cross a bridge, and then build up the other side. Repeated time after time after time. It was a most extraordinary feat, but it did work, and you eventually got, by January 1945, the connection to the Burma Road and more supplies going through to China. So, all Chindit brigades were back in India by the end of August 44, and officially the Chindits were disbanded by February 45. It's a, disappointment to them, but at the same time, Mountbatten did say, actually, the whole of 14th Army is now, all our units are Chindit-minded, which is a sort of good epitaph in a way. 77th Brigade themselves, they were reconstituted and re-rolled as a parachute brigade in the newly created 44th Indian Airborne Division, and they started training, parachute training, etc., ready for the invasion of mainland Japan. But, as we all know, 2 atomic bombs, August, Japan surrendered, and thank goodness they weren't needed to go in and do a mainland invasion. So, what was the contribution of the Chindits to overall victory? I'm afraid General Bill Slim, in Defeat into Victory, said some nice things, splendid example of courage and hardihood, but wasteful. They did not give militarily a worthwhile return for the resources in men, material and time that they absorbed. It's about 2 divisions worth, and he argued that he could have done more with 2 complete divisions that had been broken up to provide the manpower for the 6 Chindit brigades. So that was Bill Slim's view. We then have Sir Robert Thompson, later to be the civilian commander in Malaya with Templar, but he was Wingate's Air Force advisor. He was an Air Force officer. So Sir Robert Thompson said it was a sound idea, but the Chindits were just badly handled and used for operations they were not equipped or trained for, referring to the time after Wingate's death when Stilwell used them wrongly to attack towns and Hill 2171 and all that, Hill 60 and things like that. So that was the time they had their most casualties, because they were not doing normal Chindit stuff of sneaking through the jungle and coming out and doing ambushes. So that was Sir Robert Thompson's view. I think Operation Longcloth, the first operation, that changed the strategic paradigm in Burma for both the Allies and the Japanese. It, obviously, we talked about it earlier, galvanised British morale, innovated and refined ideas on air support, and you heard things like the admin box worked well with the new ideas on staying where you were and getting air resupply. But in this strategic level, it enabled Churchill to demonstrate to Roosevelt that we could, as British, still contribute to the effort to keep the nationalist Chinese in the war, fixing that 750,000 Japanese troops in China. And also, the Japanese got the wrong lessons. General Mutaguchi, the commander of the 15th Army in Burma, he tried to copy the Chindit penetration tactics. If they can do it, so can we. But he missed a couple of key points. He didn't have air superiority to enable air resupply, and really, that was probably the biggest fault. So his own troops, at the end of long sort of jungle paths, were not properly resupplied, and they didn't have full strength attacking Imphal and Kohima. And basically, the whole Ugo offensive against Imphal and Kohima failed, and that was the turning point that Slim was then able to use as the sort of the baseline to start coming south and freeing Burma. Operation Thursday had an even greater effect. It obviously supported the US and Chinese advance to Myitkyina and the re-establishment of the Burma Road, which is a crucial sort of top-level aim. It's also supported the defence of Imphal and Kohima in a number of ways. Prior to the fly-in of 77 Brigade, the Air Force in India had done a sweep of all Japanese airfields, and they destroyed most of the Japanese Air Force on the ground. Thereafter, the Japanese Air Force was pretty well ineffective for the rest of the Burma campaign. So that preliminary air operation alone was a huge step forward, a huge benefit. The Japanese 15th Army headquarters with Mutaguchi, he couldn't move his headquarters forward because of the Chindits in the way, and that meant he had less good feel for what was going on with his 4 divisions, gave less good orders, and of course the logistic support was separated from those 4 divisions, all contributing to poor performance by those advanced divisions attacking Imphal and Kohima. Particularly, the 15th and the 31st divisions had their lines of communication interdicted. What little was trying to be delivered forward, a lot of it was not getting through. Also, elements of the 15th Division and Mutaguchi's strategic reserve, the 53rd Division, were turned around and went backwards to try and deal with what the Chindits were doing in the Japanese guts, as Wingate called it. And the 31st Division, up round Kohima, when they themselves lost, their defeat and their retreat was started like a domino effect along the front line of the Japanese forces and precipitated the overall collapse of Operation Ugo. And finally, the 18th Japanese Division facing Stilwell also had their line of communication interdicted. So, final thoughts. Brigadier Mike Calvert, his view was Imphal and Kohima was won by nearly 9 divisions with armour, artillery and strong air support against 3 Japanese divisions, whereas the Chindits, roughly 2 light divisions in strength, destroyed about a division's worth from various places and diverted and partly destroyed a second, all in their rear area while interdicting lines of communications to both Japanese fronts. So quite a lot of bang for the buck of 2 divisions. Overall conclusion then, whether you take the official view, Slim, and indeed the official history tried to play down the Chindits' contribution to victory, there were definite direct and indirect military effects on the ground. And as strategic value, it helped to keep the Allies together, kept China in the war, and supported Allied pressure on Japan. And I suppose whichever side of those you go on, I don't think anyone can deny that that relatively small Chindit force made a priceless contribution out of all proportions its size to the alliance, to the defence of India, and the reconquest of Burma, and the eventual overall victory over Japan. There we go.